Thanks, Jim. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm so crazy about riparian systems. I came all the way from Syracuse, New York, because I hear you have some good riparian zones here in California. So I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker, and then our plenary speakers for the first session immediately afterwards. So I'm thrilled to introduce Jody Hilty. I met Jody back in 1996 when we were both started at UC Berkeley together in the environmental science policy and management. And back then, the thing that struck me about Jody was that she was crazy about wildlife corridors. She is obsessed with corridors. And she is one of the most foremost conservation on a landscape scale scientists working today. In fact, she wrote a book about corridors, wildlife corridors, and for many years was the executive director of the Wildlife Conservation Society, based in Bozeman, the program for North America. Now, for the last 2 years, she's been the executive director for Yellowstone to Yukon initiative, which is one of the most extensive and first landscape level conservation projects worldwide. So she's going to give us a vision about what we can do with corridors, and I encourage you to think about how we can adapt that to riparian systems. So thanks, Jody.
Thank you all for being here. Woo, loud. Appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all, and I'm looking forward to learning from you all as some of the riparian experts. Y2Y, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is an organization, I should probably put this up, but it's an organization that partners with lots of different scientists, so if you have an idea of work you want to do in Y2Y that's going to help us understand how to do better conservation, come talk to me. All right, so it takes a group of riparian ecologists to get me away from Kananaskis country and in Alberta where I live, because right now, this time of the year, is the time of year when you can see this. This is a golden eagle, and it's using the Miyastacus, which is a native word for the backbone of North America, the Rocky Mountains. If you're lucky, you can sit right near my house and you can see up to 200 golden eagles an hour making this trip. This is Yellowstone to Yukon, so come on up and check it out. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about what Y2Y is to give you a sense of what it is that we do. Then I'm going to immediately move into sort of what we're doing around headwaters conservation, and I want your input and feedback on that over the next couple of days, and then talk to you about where we need to continue to go to achieve our vision. But before I do that, I want to back up. Let's talk about conservation. So conservation is really a new idea. If you were to look at a global map, you'd see that over the last 150 years, we've actually been increasing our protected areas over time. So how is the US doing since we're sitting there? We did a review that we published about a year ago on US conservation, and I think we're doing all right. But when you look at lands for the United States defined by what are protected areas by the IUCN protected area definition, we're at 13.3%. Do you know that countries out like Bhutan have 50% of their lands in protected areas? We have a ways to go. Do you know that most countries, not the United States, but most countries in the world have pledged to get to 17% protected areas by 2020? We got to keep moving if we're gonna do it. On the ocean side of things, less than 3% of U.S. oceans are considered protected. That's really not great. And then you get to riparian zones and water, fresh water. The status? Unknown. There is no national data set on how our waters are doing and how well they're protected. I hope that maybe somebody in this room will take it on to figure that out going forward. All right. Let's go back to my neck of the woods, the Rocky Mountains, the Yellowstone to Yukon region. This is the area where most of the wildlife that existed pre-European arrival still are able to persist. This is the place where natural processes like floods and fires can occur over large landscapes. We need to keep it that way. It's one of the most intact mountain ecosystems in the world. So what led to the creation of this thing called Yellowstone to Yukon? Well, really it was landscape ecology. And it was the tools that came along with landscape ecology that allowed us to see that protected areas, while absolutely essential, are not going to conserve our biodiversity. Some of the more charismatic animals, like this wolf, Pluie the wolf, it's a female, really demonstrate this well. So this wolf traveled over 2 countries, 2 provinces, 2 states, a couple of different reserves and Native American reservations, 30 different jurisdictions before she was legally harvested, along with her pups, just south of Kootenay National Park. It made the communities, the conservation communities in Canada and the conservation communities in the United States, talk to each other and go, wow, we got to do something about this, because there wasn't really any active collaboration. So Y to Y was really the first effort to collaborate in an international sense. Another impetus for this was looking at really the shrinking of where large animals were allowed to roam. So this map over here shows how widespread carnivores and ungulates were pre-European contact, and then where they're left right now. This red area, that's Y to Y. So after a lot of nattering and looking at a lot of science data, the conservation community said, okay, we're going to define the area that we need to conserve, one of the most intact mountain ecosystems in the world, Yellowstone to Yukon, a 2,000-mile stretch of land from the Arctic Circle all the way down just below Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. And our goal is to connect it and protect it so that both people and nature can thrive. Okay, well, that's all good and stuff, but we're here at a Riparian conference, so let's talk a little bit about water. Really, the veins of life for the Yellowstone to Yukon are the 13 river systems and the tributaries into those river systems. Very conservatively, the Y to Y region provides water for 15 million people, some of them Californians, only because they ship it over. But it's a very important source of water, and if you look, it goes, this is what drains to the Arctic, what drains to the Atlantic, and what drains to the Pacific. So 3 major river systems. It's pretty amazing that way. So I'm going to back up and talk a little bit generically about what it means to have a large vision and what happens when you have a large vision. Because a lot of people say it's all good and well to have a large vision, but what really happens when you have it? One of the reasons I took the job to run the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative is because vision works. So this is the protected areas when the vision was first created in 1993. 11% of the area was in formal IUCN protected status. 20 years later, and actually we're coming upon 25 now, we almost doubled the number of protected areas. And we were able to increase the conservation status on about 30% of the other land. So that means maybe removing off-road vehicles from places where they're inappropriate. It might mean caribou habitat. None of those are necessarily permanent, but they're management for better conservation. So just so you can get a look at it side by side, there's a lot of improvement there. We have a long way to go, so we'll get there. Back to water. So again, we work with a lot of different scientists. We have over 300 partners, First Nations, sometimes agencies, sometimes scientists who work with us. In this case, this is a group of scientists who wrote about gravel-bed river systems. This is fundamental to Y to Y. Almost all of our river systems are gravel bed ecosystems. What's cool about this paper is that the scientists on this paper, some of them are microbial biologists, some of them are grizzly bear biologists, but what they found is that these gravel bed ecosystems, like this, everything happens in the river system. So if you're a grizzly bear, most of what you eat is found in this floodplain here. And the larger river system. If you're a wolf, you're more likely to make a kill down here in this valley than anywhere else, not up in the high mountains. So if you want to see wolves, go to the gravel bed ecosystems. Everything happens here. My town, the town of Canmore, right outside of Banff, it sits right on top of 150 feet of water. I would dare say that that's not a great place to put a town, but it's there. And most people don't understand, you all do, that the river is not this. The river is from here to here. And that's what I'm talking about. That's what's really important if you want to conserve biodiversity, and why you have to conserve the whole thing. So let's talk about, and I want to add to that if you don't do a good job of conserving the whole thing, given that climate change is happening, we are going to see massive disruption to that system. We're going to see increasing floods. We're going to see the increasing problems. I don't need to talk to Californians about fire right now, but climate change is coming, and the better job we do conserving these gravel bed ecosystems, the better chance we have of withstanding these kinds of changes that we're going to be seeing. So I'm going to start off with a few examples of how it is that we go about conserving entire watersheds. So I'm going to take you up to the Northwest Territories Nahanni National Park. The park originally was this big. Why was it this big? There was a hydro dam that was proposed in the area. And luckily, a prime minister got to go down that river and said, whoa, this is way too special of a place to have a hydro dam. So he created a park that was about a mile wide. Well, that's all good and well, but then pressures started to come along, like massive mega mines and other kinds of development in the region. And people started to realize that maybe the river itself wasn't protected, let alone the biodiversity. Right around that time, Parks Canada came up with a definition for their parks that said that their parks needed to maintain ecological integrity. There was the opportunity. So it took a whole group of people, because that's how conservation works in the Y2Y region. The first are the Decho people. This is Grand Chief Herb Norwegian. And he himself and his people are pushing for half, actually they started with 3/4 of their traditional territory to be protected. The Northwest Territories government didn't accept that, so they're pushing for half. This is all under, I won't get into it, but it's all under reconciliation, which is a process that's happening right now in Canada to reconcile what happened with Indigenous people in Canada. Herb is one of these people, and many of the First Nations up there believe this, but conservation is reconciliation. So he's pushing that forward. It takes scientists, so this is one of the First Nation members with a colleague of mine, John Weaver, who set out to do some of the biological research, the Western science research, to complement the traditional knowledge. And he led the grizzly bear work, the caribou work, and the Dall's sheep work to try to figure out how big of a place do we need to sustain viable populations of these low-density animals out there. And so they went out and they did non-invasive work. They set out these barbed wire circles. They'd put really smelly stuff in it. The bear would come, they'd get hair snags, and they would begin to be able to build a story of relatedness and how many animals were actually in the Nahanni region and how big of a space might we need to sustain a population. That kind of science, which I won't go into, also went forward for Dall's sheep and for caribou, and was fundamental, really, really important for Parks Canada to have that science in order to expand the park. But we also needed people who understood how to push policy, because science gets us partway there, but we need to have people who make it possible for federal governments or any government to push forward and create a protected area, but also make it impossible for them not to. And so Harvey Locke, who is a co-founder of Y2Y and a strategic planner for Y2Y, was part of that process with a number of other partners. And lo and behold, Parks Canada announced this more than 6 times, the expansion of the park to be 6 times bigger than it was, 3.5 times bigger than Yellowstone National Park. Now I want you to see there is a donut in the middle there. That is a proposed mine. It existed before the park. It's something that we hope to finish off, but it remains a controversy. But we've done a much better job of protecting the whole system, which will protect the river itself. For those of you who want to go out and get an adventure, there's no way to get there by road, but this is Nahanni Falls, or is the Virginia Falls in Nahanni. It is higher than Niagara, and it has more water flowing through it than the Grand Canyon. Truly magnificent. Okay, so let's go back. So that's one small section of Y2Y, though. So what I'm going to do is talk about how we add up what we do across the larger region, because it's about Y2Y. It's about the whole thing. So how is it that we take a place like this? By the way, those are larch trees. I never knew this, but these evergreen trees, they actually shed their needles. It's so cool. So you should come up and see them sometime. Prime time right now when you can see the gold eagles too. How do we take these massive valleys that are undeveloped? Well, it turns out not all of them are undeveloped. This is what one of them looks like today. This is something called the Site C Dam. Many of you have probably never heard of it. It's a mega dam that's being proposed, the third dam, ABC, in northeastern British Columbia on the Peace River. It is a complete catastrophe. The science says that it shouldn't move forward. It's an earthen dam. There's nothing to really anchor it to. From an economic perspective, they're already over $1 billion in debt. The problems go on and on and on. The economists have come out. It's quite a depressing place. This is the larger picture of the place. That river, or that dam would go right here. You see there's a park there. All of that work that was being done in the previous photo here is actually on a provincial park. They denuded the entire provincial park. What I want you to know about this particular place is it's the narrowest part of the Y2Y region, and the Peace River is really this east-west river that runs across it. It's super important. It's incredibly productive for both biodiversity. It also has some of the best agriculture in British Columbia. And these red lines, these are linear disturbances, roads, pipelines, you name it. This is where the natural gas comes from, or one of the places, to get the oil out of the oil sands, or what Americans call the tar sands, right? This place is really, really heavily impacted. Well, it turns out that there are a couple of heroes that are speaking out against it. These, on my left and right here in this photo, are 2 chiefs of Treaty 8 First Nations. They are mad. Chief Roland Wilson on the left said, he's quite inspirational. If you ever have a chance to meet him, he said, "I want to eat caribou before I die." He can't eat caribou because they're in massive decline, and some of the populations have already gone extinct because of those red lines. Turns out he's been poisoning his kids for the last 10 years when they go to their traditional fishing sites, because the previous dams have emitted so much methyl mercury that they're literally poisoning their kids. He's done. He wants to see this ecosystem rebalanced. He's a hero in this project. And the good news is that the government in British Columbia just switched. There's now a commission that's looking at this dam, and it looks very promising that they're going to halt their actions and turn it back. This is how conservation gets done: science, local communities, and engagement. So my hope for them and for the wildlife in that region is that they can find a way to restore their systems, both for people and for wildlife in the future. So let's go a little bit further south. This is Greater Yellowstone in the bottom. Salmon Selway has no bears. Crown of the Continent has some bears. These bears have been isolated from the rest of the population for years and years. What does that have to do with riparian zones, you say? Everything. The biggest threat for bears is that everybody saw a river runs through it, and they all want homes in Montana right now. And most of the people want homes right next to rivers because they're beautiful. That's a problem for bears. 1 house per square mile turns it into a place where bears are more likely to die than successfully reproduce. It's bad news. Turns out that riparian areas are the travel pathways that animals like grizzly bears, wolverines, and other low-density animals use. And it turns out that a lot of the riparian areas that are in these low-elevation, private land, valley bottoms are in bad shape. What's happened over time is healthy systems like this have been degraded by overgrazing and eventually incised really deeply like this. We have 2 solutions that we've been putting forward. One is, let's reintroduce beavers where there's enough habitat, and where there's not, or where they're not culturally tolerated, we'll do beaver mimic dams like the one that my colleague here, Jeff, is building. Creating these dams is a great thing. Ranchers love it. They know, they don't say the words climate change necessarily, but they know that they have water insecurity. There's drought problems. This is the cheapest thing they can do. It's incredibly easy. We often host groups of people to come out and work on different ranches, and it has immediate, measurable impacts. In addition to that, we've been able to scientifically show if you slow down the water flow, that water doesn't just run off, it recharges the groundwater, and it comes out in the main stem of rivers like the Yellowstone, the Madison, and other rivers in August when they most need that water. So it's a win-win from a livelihoods perspective as well as a biodiversity perspective. And if we can keep these riparian areas with this kind of vegetation, what we know is that grizzly bears and other hard to get along with toothy animals can get through these corridors without being seen and are more likely to be connected. The good news of this story is that we are seeing grizzly bears closer together than ever before. Yellowstone grizzly bears are only about 70 miles away from Crown of the Continent grizzly bears. We have the possibility of reconnecting them, and it will be through riparian restoration. Okay, I'm going to move you a little bit further north with my last example. This is in Alberta. We run something called Love Your Headwaters Castle. We've already done it. We got 2 new parks already. Kananaskis is a big argument right now, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Bighorn. So again, we do all of our work with lots of other organizations. WCS did some great science to talk about the climate change impacts on biodiversity in this area and the importance of conserving it. So where is the Bighorn? Here's Banff National Park. Here's Jasper National Park. This area right here, this is the missing tooth between the 2 parks. And by the way, it used to be part of Banff National Park. So the message from a conservation perspective is you have to be on your game all the time, because you can expand parks, you can grow parks, and all it takes is one bad decision, and all of that can be rolled back. So we're really just trying to get back what we originally had. So there's a lot of reasons that we might want to connect or protect the Bighorn. From the perspective of some of us, like myself, who really likes wildlife and connectivity and things like that, it's about wildlife. But that's not what necessarily rings for other people. Really what it's about is it's about water, security, and economics. So let's talk a little bit about some of those. Turns out that the Bighorn provides the water for one of the 3 big cities in Alberta, Edmonton. 88% of Edmonton's water comes from the Bighorn. It turns out that more than 80% of the residents of Edmonton want to conserve their headwaters, and more than 63% of the rural residents that live in and around the Bighorn also want to see their headwaters protected. Why? For those of you who didn't catch the news in 2013, this is what Calgary, the city just south of Edmonton, looked like after the 2013 floods. This was a combination of a climate change event where literally the clouds got stuck over the Rockies, but also was impacted by what I would call less than optimal management of the headwaters in the Y-to-Y region that exacerbated these kinds of floods. We know that we're going to see more of these kinds of floods. One of the things we can do is secure free ecosystem services, which means conservation of headwaters. And why do we need to conserve them? Because these kinds of things are being proposed right now in the Bighorn, and mining, and other things. Here's another issue, which is it's that tug-pull of undesignated public lands where anything can happen. In Canada and in Alberta, off-road vehicles in many places can go anywhere, and you can do random camping anywhere you want. The result of that is this. Hopefully you can see these pictures, but that's a creek with endangered cutthroat trout, and lo and behold, it's just a mud pit after the off-road vehicles has gone through it. Likewise, Old Man and Hidden Creek have problems, and this is just rampant across the Front Range. And so these are the kinds of things that we need to step up and control. And it's a really hard thing because, Albertans in the past, they didn't have so many people. So a few off-road vehicles were no big deal. And what we hear from some of the older folks is, well, I want my kids and my grandkids to have the same opportunity to ride wherever they darn well please and to be able to camp wherever they want. I don't want to have to be stuck in a campground. Times have changed. The population has doubled. We got to really think about how we're going to manage those lands, not just for today, but for future generations. Because ultimately, a river like this is going to be of higher value to a larger group of society, since only 7% of Albertans are off-road vehicle users. And yet, the opportunity to diversify economically is enormous, particularly because Alberta has the Central Rockies National Parks, and people go there in droves. If we had more parks, we would be able to spread those people out more, and there would be a greater economic return. He's telling me I only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to wrap up here pretty quick. So the reality is we have a ways to go in the Y-to-Y region, and it's really about maintaining a common vision and inviting people to engage together. It's about finding the win-wins with off-road vehicle community, with the ranching community, and having a real discussion about hydro dams. For those of you who are from the US, we're in a really different position in Canada, where you guys are talking about taking out dams. Hydro dams are the green solution in Canada. If we even talked about taking out dams, we'd be laughed out of the country. It's really, the conversations are much further behind. We're working hard with people like Wendy Palin, a scientist in British Columbia, who's working on run-of-the-river type proposals that allow hydro to happen but have a lower impact. They still have an impact, and they're only appropriate in certain places. But how can we come up with solutions that won't continue to damage the headwaters that are so important, not just for Y-to-Y, but for people well beyond Y-to-Y? I guess I'll just close by saying we don't actually know, what we need to achieve our vision of connecting and protecting Y-to-Y for people and for wildlife for now and for future generations. But we know we need a lot more. We know we're not there. And I think people like E.O. Wilson, who have had a lifetime to think about and watch what's happened in the world, it's pretty inspiring to hear him say we need something like Half Earth. My hope is that Y-to-Y can be one of those landscapes where we try that out and see if we can get to half, have we done it, and what half do we need, and how do we do it in a vision that's cohesive and not just sort of randomized protected areas. So I'll end there, and if they say, whoops, well, we just zoomed through that. So I could take a question or two. Am I allowed, Stefan? Okay.
States and Canada and Mexico, could you envision another large swath?
Great question. So she asked, where else could we envision another large swath? There is another effort that several of us at Y2Y helped to create on the eastern coast in the Appalachians called 2 Countries, 1 Forest. I learned recently, I was at a conference in Hawaii, and I was sitting on a shuttle going to the conference, and this woman said, "You're from Y2Y?" I'm from B2B. It was inspired by you all. B2B is Baja to Bering. How cool is that? I didn't even know about that. There's another effort called Paseo Pantera, which is called Path of the Panther, which is through Mesoamerica and in theory could extend up into the southern United States if we had more than one jaguar in the southern United States. There's lots of really great large landscape efforts. I think the migratory bird work that's going on in the Great Plains is another different kind, but another really important one given the lack of conservation status of most grasslands. One more question, he says. Yes?
You showed initially the map that wolves that cruised all over the place, totally going outside of the conservation areas. And are you or the other groups, integrating farmlands or private lands or like non-conservation areas into it? Is there some sort of...
Absolutely.
So can you talk about that?
So she asked if we're including non-conservation lands in the vision, and it is so essential. And in fact, if you go to rural Idaho, you'll hear that the rumor that Y2Y is really part of the United Nations, and it's really about black helicopters coming down and trying to take away everybody's private lands. And in fact, that wouldn't work, and that's not what we're about. It's about working with communities and finding those places that are essential for wildlife and can be win-wins for communities. So we work a lot with land trusts. In fact, we just made a land purchase up in Troy, Montana that took one of the wildlife corridors from 50% protected up to about 70% protected. A land trust in that community, in fact, that local land trust would never buy that particular piece of land, but the grizzly bear biologist said, here are the 3 corridors, and this is the piece of land that the bears are using, and other wildlife are too. And so we'll complete the second half of that purchase next August, and that's an outright purchase, but sometimes it's about working with communities. The Cabinet Purcell Collaborative, there were 10 bears. There were huge wildlife conflicts with bears, and I'm focusing on bears right now, but we focus on a lot of other things too. And what was really important was working with that community. We put in, I think, 97 electric fences around orchards, chicken coops, everything that are attractants. Last summer, there was not a single reported human-wildlife conflict, and the grizzly bear population is up to 50. So it's really about working hand in hand with people and communities on collaborative solutions to be successful in the long term. Thank you.